Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu, and welcome to Pakistan in Perspective, a special series examining the state of minority and human rights in Pakistan from a historical, legal, and philosophical perspective. In the course of our series, we will cover a wide range of topics, including Pakistan's foundational approach to minority and human rights, the specific laws and legislation that have adversely impacted minority rights, the exclusion of Pakistan's minorities from the political process, and the prospects for meaningful reform in Pakistan. To help analyze these matters, we've assembled a group of experts, which include some of Pakistan's leading jurists, journalists, and intellectuals. Today's program explores the early years of Pakistan's founding, and particularly Mr. Muhammad Ali Jinnah's original vision for minority rights. We will also be discussing the constitutional framework for minority rights in Pakistan, with a particular emphasis on the 1973 and current constitution. What does it mean to be a minority in Pakistan? And has Pakistan adequately provided protections for minority rights? Joining me in the studio to discuss these matters are two very distinguished lawyers from Pakistan. On my right is Mr. Abid Hassan Minto, who is a senior lawyer, an advocate before the Supreme Court of Pakistan, and a constitutional law expert. Mr. Minto, it's an honor to have you with us today. And on my left is Mr. Mujibur Rahman, who is also a senior lawyer, an advocate before the Supreme Court of Pakistan, and a scholar of Islamic Sharia law and other related subjects. And both our guests have many decades of experience defending minority rights in court, so it'll be very interesting to hear their perspectives. Before turning to our panelists, let me set the stage a bit. Pakistan has a population of roughly 187 million people. That makes it the sixth most populous country in the world. There are at least 6 million Pakistanis who belong to dozens of minority religious and ethnic groups in Pakistan. And if you include the Shia community as a minority, that number is in the tens of millions. So the question of minority rights carries great weight and significance. On August 11th, 1947, Pakistan's most famous founder, Mr. Muhammad Ali Jinnah, delivered a keynote speech to the First Constituent Assembly. And that speech has been viewed by many historians and scholars as a seminal pronouncement of Pakistan's deep commitment to minority rights and to religious freedom. For the benefit of our audience, I will read a portion of that address now. He said, "You are free. You are free to go to your temples. You are free to go to your mosques or to any other places of worship within the state of Pakistan. You may belong to any religion or caste or creed. That has nothing to do with the business of the state. We are starting with this fundamental principle, that we are all citizens and equal citizens of one state. Now, I think we should keep that in front of us as our ideal, and you will find that in course of time, Hindus would cease to be Hindus and Muslims would cease to be Muslims. Not so much in the religious sense, because that's a matter of personal faith of each individual, but in the political sense, as citizens of the state." We had the opportunity to ask several leading scholars on Pakistan to share their impressions of Mr. Jinnah's historic address. Let's take a quick listen.
Basically, I'm in sympathy with Jinnah's speech to the Constituent Assembly in 1947. Now we are all citizens of a state, and it doesn't matter whether you are Muslims or Hindus or Sikhs or Parsis. We are all equal. Well, that was never implemented. You know, and who knows what would have happened had he stayed alive, but that was never implemented.
But on 11th of August 1947, he was elected President of the Constituent Assembly of Pakistan, whose task was to frame the Constitution. So in that capacity, for the first time he expressed his views on the framework, on the Constitution of Pakistan. Therefore, it is the foundational speech, nothing else.
He took 2-3 days to think about and write this speech. So it was a calculated effort, and his vision for Pakistan was not on the spur of a moment. It was his ideal, and it was his idea which he thought about properly for a long time before saying this. So to express this practically, he started this session of Constituent Assembly without the recitation of Holy Quran, and the session was presided over by a Hindu parliamentarian, Jogendranath Mandal. So in an Islamic state, a Hindu will not preside over the session of the Constituent Assembly of a Muslim Constituent Assembly. Then when he appointed the first federal cabinet of 6 members, the law ministry again went to Jogendranath Mandal. Now it is unthinkable that in an Islamic state, the law minister will be a Hindu.
This is the greatest speech made by Mr. Muhammad Ali Jinnah, because he made countless speeches, but he spoke as the President of the Muslim League. This was the first time he was speaking as the prospective head of a state. See? There is no other speech before that in which he spoke as a prospective or a designated head of the state. Therefore, its scope, its ambit is much vaster than all the speeches he had made during the struggle for Pakistan, including his speeches on the Pakistan resolution. I consider this speech is more important because those speeches were related to a demand. And this speech, laid down a framework for performance.
Besides this, that he said that you are free to go to your temples, you are free to go to your mosque or any other place of worship you want to. It has nothing to do with the business of politics. He summed up this speech by saying that if you follow this policy, now this is within quotes, if you follow this policy, you will see that after some time, Hindus will cease to be Hindus and Muslims will cease to be Muslims. Not in the religious sense. This is a very important sentence, very important. Not in the religious sense, because religion is a personal matter of faith for every individual. But for political purposes, all citizens of Pakistan will have equal rights. Now this sentence, that religion is a personal matter of faith for every individual, this is the basis of democratic movement throughout the world.
You see, visions are in that way, sometimes mirages that people pursue. But now that we have had 64 years of history and experience, now it is compulsion. You see, Pakistan can survive only by sticking to this formula, and if it does not adhere to this formula, there will be no Pakistan.
So we'll now turn to our panelists and begin our discussion. Mr. Minto, help us understand the broad question. What exactly is a minority, and how has Pakistan defined it?
Well, there are minorities and minorities. We are talking in the context of Pakistan specifically, then we have certain problems. Because minorities identify themselves as minorities in a variety of states. There was no problem when Muslims in the United India were thought to be a second nation or a second community as compared to the Hindus who were in majority. So they are called minority in a country or in a state on the basis of the majority of the populace which lives in that state. So that's one way, because there is no legal or constitutional definition anywhere in the world which defines particularly what minority will be. There are minorities who accept their status as minorities, because in Pakistan there was no difficulty in calling Hindus as religious minorities or the Christians as religious minorities. They said that we are religiously speaking in minority, and it is a fact of history that they were in minority in a state which was populated overwhelmingly by the Muslims. So they wanted their status to be determined constitutionally and legally in a society in which the majority of the population belongs to a certain religious creed. Difficulty arises when within the mainstream Muslim society itself, there appear groups and sects which deviate from the mainstream itself. And it started right from the beginning. So the Shias, as you mentioned in your introductory comment, that Shiites were a part of the mainstream Muslim society, and yet they were separate from the principal group of people who were actually ruling at that point of time. And historically, this ruling group was changing hands between the Shiites on the one side and the non-Shiites or the Hanafis on the other side. So therefore there is no difficulty, but they never claimed, neither of them in any particular situation claimed that they were in minority. They had their connection with the mainstream Muslim religion itself, and therefore they were comfortable that they are the majority. And yet within the majority itself, the different sects, they had their internal differences of opinion. The issue became an issue of conflict only when a group of people by the majority Muslim community or the mainstream Muslim community was not willing to recognize as part of them. That becomes the difficulty. Within a Muslim majority society, a group of people who claim that they are Muslims are not recognized by the rest of the Muslims or a majority of the Muslims to be the Muslims, and a conflict arises. So therefore, whether they recognize them or not, they do not recognize them as a part of the mainstream itself is a religious question. Those who believe in a certain faith, they may or they may not accept the other group to be a part of their faith.
So Mr. Rahman, it would seem that the question of whether someone is a minority is fascinating in Pakistan, because there are groups that would self-identify as such, and there are those who have been perhaps thrust upon them is this label of being a minority. What are your impressions on that?
Well, if you look at the, as my friend said, and he has given a deep insight into it, that minority as such has not been defined anywhere in the Constitution or anywhere in the, there is no precise definition of what a minority is. But nevertheless, we know what the minorities are in a particular society. So my idea is that minority exists as a fact of history. Minorities are an underprivileged, left out group of the society which have not thoroughly merged into the mainstream society and have been left behind, they feel threatened because of their number or because of their handicap, having been left out politically or socially or economically, and they seek recognition of their status, and they wish to maintain their identity as such, and therefore all the constitutions around the world, they particularly provide that their identity shall be preserved. So they exist, they want recognition, they want a continuance of their identity. So the minority stands out in a society. And when the political, in the context of political science, we see in a democratic setup, privileges or weightage is given to minority, which is an inclusionary process. In an ideal democracy, there should be no concept of underprivileged or overprivileged classes. So in a democratic setup, an effort is made to draw them into the main line, into the mainstream, and the process is that of integration. So the constitutional process regarding minority is a process of integration. The difficulty arises, and for something that my friend has mentioned has happened in Pakistan, minorities exist, they demand their recognition, they are not created. If a minority is created by fiction of law, then what you are doing is you are adopting an exclusionary process and you are driving a section of the mainstream out of the mainstream, and in that process you are not protecting their rights. You are in fact depriving them of their rights. The very purpose of if you at all, if it is possible or if it is desirable, you are creating something by a fiction of law, and the purpose is to deprive them of their rights. So that is not what should be done in a democratic setup.
So Mr. Minto, there are obviously definitional concerns of minorities, but what is very evident is the idea of protections for minorities in Pakistan has steadily declined or has changed over time. You had the opportunity to hear some of the impressions of some of Pakistan's commentators about Jinnah's vision, Mr. Jinnah's vision. What went wrong?
Well, in fact, the majority says Mr. Jinnah went wrong. So that's the difficulty. You see, it's a question of interpretation. They say that what Mr. Jinnah said on the 11th of August has to be interpreted in the context of his philosophy of two-nation theory. And therefore, what he said on the 11th of August cannot be isolated from the actual politics that he was leading right from the year 1940 onwards, particularly, but even before that. You see, but then all sorts of the philosophies were propounded. They said that when Muhammad bin Qasim came here for the first time, the foundations for Pakistan were laid at that point of time, which actually means that a Muslim coming in a non-Muslim state as a conqueror, when he enters that premise, then on that geography, the foundations of a parallel statehood are created. So this is all historical. The issue is whether two-nation theory is in conflict with the 11th of August or not. My answer is it is not, because two-nation theory is in a larger context of India. It's a theory in which Mr. Jinnah and the Muslim League and those who followed the two-nation theory, they said they wanted to assert their rights in a majority Hindu population as a minority. And they said that the minority rights cannot be properly safeguarded in this kind of a situation, and they wanted a separate statehood. That's all. What kind of state that will be was announced for the first time on the 11th of August 1947. There is no speech earlier made in such a categorical fashion by Mr. Jinnah or any other political leader of Muslim League which determines the nature and character of the state itself. And the significance is that Mr. Jinnah at that point of time was making a statement before a constituent assembly. And the second significance of his statement is that he was himself the president of that Constituent Assembly. And the third the importance of this statement is that he is making that statement at a time when he is not merely the member and chairman or the president of the Constituent Assembly, he is simultaneously the president of his own party. He is also the head of the state, having been designated as the Governor General of Pakistan. So he had three capacities. And in all these capacities together, he addresses those who were to make the Constitution of Pakistan, where he says, this will be a constitution which will be democratic. There cannot be a democratic constitution conceived where you say that state has a religion.
So, Mr. Rahman, we see that Mr. Jinnah's pronouncements, his ideals, were accepted in the sense that people in the foundation of Pakistan wanted to see that these fundamental freedoms were enshrined. But we also see at the same time that there was a struggle for that vision to be articulated and transformed legally into Pakistan's constitution. And indeed, it took many years before Pakistan's constitution, the current one, was founded. Explain to us a bit more about that constitutional history.
See, constitutional history is a very long affair to discuss. I mean, 1956 Constitution itself was a set of compromises, and 1956 Constitution, which was the first ever constitution written, and which of course did not work for very long, in that constitution, the compromise basically was to deprive the majority of their majority rights. The people in East Pakistan were in the majority, but their majority was not recognized, and they worked out, with great difficulty, they worked out a formula of parity, which was in effect depriving the majority, their majority in the House. So there's a long history, and then martial laws intervened, and there were the different interventions. Finally, we came to the 1973 Constitution. But whether you look at the 1956 Constitution or 1962 Constitution, which Ayub Khan gave as a dictator, of course, it was drafted by a great lawyer, Manzoor Qadir. But that Constitution, and then ultimately 1973 Constitution. If you look at the three constitutions, whatever the majority or the right wing or obscurantist section of population of Pakistan might be thinking, some people say that with the objective resolution we deviated from the principles of Qaeda Azam. We may have. There's a point in that. I am not for the time being touching that. But the point is that even so, when the Constitution was in fact implemented or when it was drafted, those principles were incorporated. Freedom of faith was incorporated. Minority rights were incorporated to start with. What happened later on? So the problem is that the concept of Jinnah, whatever reservations people might have had against those principles in the beginning or later on, but those concepts were incorporated. The problem arises when the question comes of translating the ideals erected upon in Pakistan. That is the problem.
So let's get specific about the Constitution. And Mr. Minto, you are a constitutional law expert and have argued for the rights of minorities in court. Specifically, Article 20 of Pakistan's Constitution enshrines what is referred to as religious freedom, and it allows for the right to profess your faith. What do you believe that provision adequately ensures religious freedom?
I don't think at all, you see, because the Constitution in 1973, as my friend had said, like all other constitutions, the 1956 Constitution was a compromise between two national groups or the two ethnic communities, the one living in East Pakistan, the other living in West Pakistan, irrespective of the faith to which they belonged. But the 1973 Constitution is directly a constitution which enters into some kind of a compromise on the issue of faith itself. The whole question is, Mr. Jinnah said on the 11th of August, it will be a democratic state. It will not be a theocracy. It will not be a state where the state will have anything to do with the faith of an individual. But the 1973 Constitution begins with the question of faith. It declares the state to have a religion. And then the religion of the character which is determined in the constitutional provisions themselves. Who will determine what kind of faith the state has, whether it is a Muslim state and the Islamic state, what kind of Islam? So there is a body of people created who will determine what kind of Islam shall prevail. And their dictum or their statement or their judgment, in fact, will be binding on the people of them.
You mean the Ideology Council?
The Ideology Council, it will be referred to by the Parliament itself. So that's the one thing. Then you fix, there cannot be a democratic state where you say the president shall belong to one faith or the prime minister shall only be a Muslim. It is not democratic, because the violation of the democratic rights of equality of all people living in the society is patent in these provisions. So you begin with saying you cannot have a president who is not Muslim, and who is a Muslim, then you have to define, and then you start giving definitions of Muslims and non-Muslims, and the result is that you are marginalizing all those people whose equality you are promising elsewhere in the Constitution, or whose equality was promised by the Quaid-e-Azam on the 11th of August.
And Mr. Rahman, with respect to Article 20, there are also several other articles that do speak about minority rights, that do speak about equality. And specifically, we know Article 25, we know Article 36 of Pakistan's 1973 Constitution. Do you think that the Constitution, those provisions, do track, are consistent with the original vision that Mr. Jinnah had?
I don't think they are consistent at all. Mr. Minto mentioned what I had missed in my observations, and very precisely that the Constitution to start with was impregnated with the violation of the principles of Quaid-e-Azam. When you provide a state religion, then you provide an Islamic Ideology Council, and then you try to specify certain offices. I think Mr. Minto so rightly and so pointedly pointed out, when you say that a person would belong to an office will go to a person belonging to a particular faith, you necessarily have to define the faith. And that is where the whole trouble started. If there was no requirement of Constitution that a president will be Muslim, we did not have to define who is a Muslim. I mean, that is one thing which he has pointed out. But what I am trying to say, that all the provisions of the Constitution, Article 20, Article 27, Article 25, Article 36, you mentioned, Article 36 incidentally is only, it deals with the principles of policy. The policy will have to be implemented by the state, and many of the policies of the laid down in that chapter have not been implemented by the state at all. But I think the real test came when the question of electorate came in. When the question of electorate comes, then the minority status is recognized or foisted or given or not given to a particular group of people. So when you start with the election laws, when it comes to the participatory process of the citizens of Pakistan, and that citizenship, mind you, I believe, and Quaid-e-Azam believed, citizenship is indivisible. You cannot have two tiers of citizenship, first rate citizen, second. So when the question of electorate comes, when the question of representation, participation of the society in the lawmaking process or in the administration of the country comes, it is there that the minority really...
That's a fascinating distillation of the constitutional history. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for this program. But I would like to thank our panelists for joining us. Our special series continues, and join us for next week's program, in which we take a closer look at this question of religion and whether a state, Pakistani state in particular, can define who is or is not a Muslim for purposes of the law. Again, we thank our panelists, and we look forward to seeing you in our next program. Thank you very much.